Our scripture this morning is from Luke. His parents went to Jerusalem every year at the feast of the Passover. And when he was 12 years old, they went up there according to the custom of the feast. And as they were returning there after spending the full number of days required, the boy Jesus stayed behind in Jerusalem, but his parents were unaware of it. Instead, they thought that he was somewhere in the caravan, and they went a day's journey, and then they began looking for him among their relatives and acquaintances. And when they did not find him, they returned to Jerusalem looking for him. Then, after 3 days, they found him in the temple, sitting in the midst of the teachers, both listening to them and asking them questions. And all who heard him were amazed at his understanding and his answers. When Joseph and Mary saw him, they were bewildered, and his mother said to him, "Son, why have you treated us this way? Behold, your father and I have been anxiously looking for you." And he said to them, "Why is it that you were looking for me? Did you not know that I had to be in my Father's house?" Which also can be translated as business. And yet they, on their part, did not understand the statement that he made to them. And he went down with them and came to Nazareth, and he continued to be subject to them. And his mother treasured all these things in her heart. And Jesus kept increasing in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and people.
Here's this text again that says Mary pondered these things in her heart. Mary treasured these things. Mary's got this interiority going on. First, when the angel comes to her and announces, and is loud and "Don't be afraid," Mary treasures. And then later when the shepherds return glorifying God for all they had seen as Scripture had told them, they're on the hillside and they come back, and Mary ponders these things in her heart. And now by my count, a third time in this text at the temple, where Mary ponders these things. What's going on after she finds Jesus in the temple? Interiority today, but especially a widening is what I want to talk about. In 2024, a lot of us are thinking about slimming down. A lot of us are saying, okay, I have had enough Christmas cookies, no more cookies. A lot of us are saying this, in 2024, I want to get a little more fit, more walking, more dog walking, more running, whatever it is. I want you to remember that in 2024, your pastor wants you to get wider. 2024, let's be wider. Next week, by the way, baptism. We start in earnest with the Jesus story, not the preamble, but Jesus himself standing with John in the Jordan, this great journey. We finally get to meet Jesus after all of Advent and Christmas. He's an adult. He's getting baptized. Next week, right here, by the way, and this might be new for a lot of you. Well, how about this? Raise your hand if you've ever done a renewal of baptismal vows. A few, all right, well, a handful of us. It's become an important part of my sense of self and ministry and congregational leadership, whether you stood up in front of someone and made a declaration of faith, or whether you were stood up in front of someone and cried like I did, while someone else baptized you as a baby. Either way, next week we affirm baptism. We talk about Jesus and John, and we'll have you, and there'll be a little water involved. Don't worry. It's going to be fun. An important part of us in our own spiritual journeys as we start to track the Jesus story in earnest. We already covered the Magi and Advent, and so we've got this opportunity this year to do a story that seldom comes up in the lectionary. I have some reasons why it doesn't come up very often. It's the odd story, the only story we have of Jesus as a kid. Every time else, we just move from expectation, Mary giving birth, and the next thing is, he's in the river with John, 30-something years old maybe. Now we got one story It's the story in the temple told only in this gospel, only in Luke 2. We don't hear it very often because we skip right ahead. I've kind of inserted Epiphany and one more. Usually this is Baptism Sunday for folks. I've put it off weeks precisely so we could finish up Epiphany and do this baptism next week. This text is interesting. I think this is in the temple. This should be, well, Epiphany celebration should be for progressives. The Ur text, the UR text, that's the reference to prehistory. Where's Abraham from? We don't even know, but there's a rumor he's from the city of Ur. No one quite knows where that was. It kind of predates even our Old Testament story. So for us, this ancient story for progressives, I think, should include this temple story. I think we find in it an example of widening and Jesus' teaching. Before we even get to Jesus, though, these magi have shown us that the meaning of Jesus is a little wider than we expected and maybe wider than we wanted. These magi are weirdos. They're from the East. They're alien. We don't know what they mean. It's surprising to us. This time of year is when we get to say, am I wide enough? How is God stretching me? And I'll know when God is stretching me if I'm being stretched a little further than I want to be, right? That's the secrecy of the star words. How much good would it be for you to paw through yourself and find a word you prefer? That's not going to be any leading at all. This is something else today. The appearing, the showing forth is what Epiphany means. Inclusion beyond our comfort. That's the message today. This is officially that Sunday, but we're including this widening story in the temple as well. If you notice the story, it says he's 12 years old. And that's a little conspicuous, isn't it? If you're thinking, wait a minute, isn't 12 the tribes? Isn't 12 the disciples? Isn't 12 the half of the 24 mentioned in Revelation? Yes, yes, yes. If you're asking, isn't that a theological rather than a chronological number? I'd have to say yes. I'm with you entirely. When we have our bat mitzvahs, our bar mitzvahs, it's right then. We're approaching adulthood. There's no teenage years in Bible times. Come 12, you're an adult, all right? 12-year-old, how to be wide. And by the way, there are, because we were talking about canon a couple weeks ago and what's official, there are a couple of non-canonic childhood stories, if you know about these. In the apocryphal Gospels that we don't include because they're very fragmentary and weird. 2 stories of Jesus as a kid. One, and because we were talking about non-canonical birth narratives a few weeks back, and a couple weeks about non-canonic fan fiction, I was calling it. A great creative use to say, what would a really cool story be to get us where we know we want to be? So the church hasn't signed off on these, but there's a story of Jesus and his buddies sitting around, and they're carving wood. Jesus, which I like, we say he's a carpenter, he's carving birds in the story. And by story, I mean a paragraph. He's carving birds, and they fly away. Cool. A little too magical and weird for the church. She said, okay, I don't know where that's from. That doesn't quite fit in with our understanding. We'll stick to just the temple. And then the other story, which would preach a little better, Jesus is on the roof with his friend, if you know this story. And I don't think that's terribly strange because you're getting out of the hot of the day, you're up there looking around. Anyway, his friend falls off and dies. A tragic, sad story for Jesus the boy, who climbs down from the roof and raises his friend to life. Now, come on, that'll preach. They should have included that. But those are non-canonic. They color from 2,000 years ago how we might think of this Jesus story in the temple. What about this boy? We learn that Jesus is a little disobedient, don't we? What do I know of Jesus as a boy? He's disobedient. He should be following his parents initially, but he's not. His family, by the way, is nice and faithful. They've gone to Jerusalem for Passover. It's a crowd. It's something that a faithful group does. And it's on the way back. This is a great insight. We're all operating as a crowd, kind of walking along the miles of road. And this must be okay where he's back with another family, or are there a group of 12-year-old kids, a bunch of what we'd call teenagers hanging out together? You know they were walking along the road. And Jesus' mom comes back and says, wait a minute, I thought he was with your family. I thought he was with your family. They can't find him, and they look for him for 3 days? And if you're thinking the same thing, well, hold on, Pastor. 3 days is from the prophets, an indeterminate period of time, Isaiah, Amos. After 3 days, he will raise us up. This is a period of time where we struggle, but God's going to come to a promise. If you're asking, what about that 3 days? Is that a theological more than a chronological number? Hold that thought for like 2 months, 3 months. We'll come back to it. After 3 days, they found him in the temple. Beautiful. You and me too. What's the question? It's a struggle. He's listening and asking questions. I think this is why we don't preach on this text as pastors, because we want him in the temple. And then he gave a 15 to 20 minute reflection on the scriptures that had just been read. Instead, Jesus is listening. This is a text for interim pastors. Listen and ask questions. For you and me too. We have a model today in the temple with this somewhat disobedient adolescent adult listening and asking questions. That's the model for interacting with our tradition and getting wider, is listen and ask questions. That's it. His parents are astonished. You should expect this response when you go to talk to your friends from your previous youth group, when you talk to your parents, kids from the tradition. When you start explaining what you think, you should expect this same response. And Mary said, "Why have you treated us like this?" Not, "Jesus, good work, nice reflection. Tell me how your personal faith's growing. Are you getting wider?" No, it's betrayal. You and me too. It can feel like betrayal to grow spiritually, to commit to being wider. You shouldn't expect it to go well, that conversation. You should have that conversation with whoever you're thinking of right now. And you should email me the next day and tell me how badly it went. You should expect to recognize betrayal. We're astonished, even Mary. It's not Mary's greatest moment in the Gospels, is it? Didn't you know I had to be about my Father's affairs, my Father's business, in my Father? Wow. It's a very high Christology. We talk about this. There's low, very human, relatable Christology in the Gospels, and there's also very high, Son of God language. We're here in that latter category. Didn't you know? I mean, the story, we haven't even met Jesus really yet, other than this. And the first thing he says is, "Didn't you know, my Father in heaven," that it's all right there. And the Gospel's trying to explain who he is. It happens early on. Next, we're just going to be standing in the river, and he's launching his career. And he increased in wisdom and stature, and Mary interiorized, pondered, thought about, what does this all mean? So, wide is a particularly conspicuously progressive goal, of course, politically, theologically, educationally, wide. And to preserve that prophetic language and that magi sense, we like thinking about Jesus and our tradition. And the answer should be something like, it's going to be wider than you're comfortable with. That's the motions we see in the Gospels and in the Bible. A continually God rule of prying open. Think of all of Paul's work. Getting wider, letting go of circumcision, dietary restrictions. Incredible. All of it getting wider. Jesus' language about women and the poor. It's all widening language for you and I. My favorite composer of all time, Bruce Cockburn. He's a Canadian. That's not why, but I've got Canadian roots. And I'm the only American born in my family, as a matter of fact. The rest are all Canadians. All Canadians. I'm still learning my direction in a round sanctuary. Bruce sings, and this is what I fell in love with 40 years ago. You get bigger as you go. No one told me, I just know. wraps up his entire career, and why, as a seminary student, I loved him, and why I still follow him and seen him in concert a handful of times. His faithful reimagining and growth. You get bigger as you go. No one told me, I just know. Illiberal religion is one of the greatest problems in our world today, right? That's why you're here, largely. Many of us have conservative backgrounds, and they said, I can't do it any longer, and it's too destructive. Religion that is not properly liberal/wide is dangerous and damaging. It's jeopardizing our country, democracy. It's denying science. It cost us a lot of lives during COVID. Illiberal religion is dangerous. But it's a challenge, isn't it? We want to define ourselves positively. We want to be as wide as possible, but we want to define ourselves somehow. It's a paradox, isn't it? This need both to be widening and including, but also have some fence, some way of saying, what do I stand for? What do I stand for, which is the same thing as saying, where do I draw the line and don't want to include? And there's some really good answers to this, but they function as a paradox. How can we decide who we are? Some talk about this canonic, non-canonic line of fencing we do as bird cage versus bird bath theology. At home, we have lots of birds in Conifer, Colorado, and I can't believe Julie's still out there in the snow feeding them, so they're still coming. If we have a bird cage hanging and you say, Don, what kind of birds do you have? I can say, well, we got a grosbeak, we got little juncos, we can go around. If we put out a bird bath and you'd ask me, Don, what kind of birds come to your bird bath? That's a little more challenging because we've got those folks and then other folks, and they'll say, well, don't come very often, and here's a squirrel that loves drinking from the bird bath. We're talking open versus closed sets, right? A closed set is all the numbers between 5 and 10 inclusive. There's 6 members to that set. Easy to figure out. Mathematical, count them. Open set, prime numbers. Multiples of 4. You easily come up with the elements of that set, but it's an open set. That's how we should think of our own widening and who we are. There are defining factors, and it's hard to make it limited, but we must put some kind of fence up. And some of you are already thinking, no, I just want everyone involved. I'll take all comers. There's a nice inclusion. Inclusion is a word we love in the liberals, right? That kind of inclusion can get a little also weak and careless, and I'm okay, you're okay, doesn't much inspire people. Whitworth College, my first philosophy class, Professor Larry Yates, Crazy Larry we called him. I'm in a class and I signed up, and only 3 of us signed up for class, so they were going to cancel the class, but then they didn't. And it was a great class, except with 3 students, it's really hard to hide if you haven't done the reading. I'd always think I didn't get to it, and the other 2 students, within minutes, I'm sure he could tell. It was on a day like this, where I was trying to engage in conversation, because you can't very well be quiet. I could hide in a lot of my other classes. No way to hide with 3 students and Dr. Yates. Dr. Yates always had chalk on the back of his jacket or his sweater, because he tended to lean back in his chair. This is just before write-on wipe-off boards. He tended to lean back in his chair against a too dirty blackboard and watch outside. We're talking to us, and look outside at the Whitworth Loop. Green grass, huge ponderosa pine trees, students lazing around, pretty girls, all sorts of distractions, my friends walking by, people looking for, Jen, I don't know if you got one of these, a virgin pine cone. A virgin pine cone being a pine cone that never touches the ground. In the loop, you'd see people walking along, and suddenly hearing the tick, 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 of a pine cone dropping from high, dropping their books, racing to find it, diving to catch it. Not an easy thing to do. I had one on my shelf in my dorm room. Larry's looking out, listening to us talk, and I must have been responding on this day in some, no doubt, profound, clever way. In some kind of inclusive way of we clergy are notorious peacemongers, right? Some way of making everything okay, undifferentiated. I'm okay, you're okay, whatever you think about this is all right. I'm trying to be loving. I'm a last born in my family. Explains a lot. Whatever I said regarding our conversation, I remember Larry looking out the window, saying, Don, looking out the window, then looking back at me, Don, never confuse an open mind with an empty head. I have thought about that line for 40 years. It's the hazard of the left, being a mile wide and an inch deep, right? Of never wanting to put a line anywhere. It's hard. It's a paradox. What can we affirm? I experience our Lord Jesus frustratingly on my fence. I have my fence, you have yours. I have my fence. Certain things up with which I will not put, as my mom would say. Certain things I include, define what does a Christian mean? That's where your fence is. Who's a person of integrity? That's your fence. Who do you hang with? There's your fence. What are the most important things for you to teach as an interim pastor in a church? It's quite a fence. And Jesus is always standing on it, looking the other way. I experience him as affirming. He loves me, yes, but never lets me sit. As I was standing on my fence, looking out, hollering, hey, who else wants to come? Who else wants to come be at play in the fields of the Lord? That's what Jesus does to me. Challenging, broadening, helping define and never being quite where I want him to be. Always just a little outside, forever calling, inviting, and challenging. Seekers, happy New Year's. Happy widening in 2024.